The news hit hard. On July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness and heavy metal icon, passed away at 76. His powerful voice, once echoing through packed arenas, fell silent, and fans everywhere felt the loss deeply. It wasn't just a death, it was the end of an era. Ozzy's final years weren't defined by headlines or tours. They were measured in hospital visits, pain thresholds, and days spent chasing the smallest trace of normal. After a life of chaos, the battle he couldn't outrun came quietly and stayed relentlessly. Parkinson's didn't arrive like a storm. It settled like fog, dulling his senses, loosening his grip, and reminding him daily that the stage was no longer his battlefield. The disease didn't just weaken him, it erased the man the world thought they knew. The energetic, unpredictable figure now moved with calculated caution. Each step required assistance. Each breath carried exhaustion. For someone who once screamed against the void, losing his voice was worse than losing fame. And as his body bent to the disease, so too did his life. Public appearances became rare. Tour plans turned into cancellations. Even speaking required rehearsals. But what the world didn't see was the war behind closed doors. The late-night falls, the whispered panic, the slow, creeping fear that he was vanishing one day at a time. Sharon stood beside him through it all, not as a rock wife, but as a full-time caregiver. And still, Ozzy fought. Through spinal surgeries, tremors, and the indignity of needing help for basic tasks, he never surrendered to bitterness. He grimaced, cursed, cracked jokes, but he endured. In interviews, he admitted the past few years had been hell, but hell was something Ozzy had known his whole life. What made this different was the helplessness. He couldn't fight this enemy with volume. He couldn't drown it in distortion. Parkinson's was a quiet thief, and it was winning. Yet even as the disease chipped away at his movement, his mind remained sharp. He still laughed, still listened to old riffs, still whispered lyrics when no one was watching. Because Ozzy Osbourne didn't know how to stop. He only knew how to keep going, even if every step now hurt. Even if no one else could hear the music anymore, he carried it, faint but burning, in his chest. Ozzy Osbourne's body was once a temple of rebellion, fueled by noise and defiance. But in the final years, it became a cage. The decades of stage dives, substance abuse, accidents, and surgeries caught up with him, not all at once, but in waves that never stopped crashing. His spine, already held together by rods, buckled further after a fall in 2019 that dislodged metal implants from a previous crash in 2003. The pain that followed wasn't a metaphor, it was real, sharp, and merciless. He couldn't sleep, couldn't walk unaided, couldn't trust his limbs to obey. And yet he tried to make it to the studio, tried to sit up straight, tried to greet visitors without wincing. Every small act became an exhausting ritual of resistance. Even breathing, something he once wasted screaming into microphones, now felt like a privilege he had to earn. The body that had carried him through madness was finally turning against him. Multiple surgeries followed, on his neck, his spine, even his lungs. Recovery was not measured in weeks. It was a slow war that drained strength from his muscles and time from his days. At one point, he confessed the pain was so unbearable, he questioned whether waking up was worth it. "I feel like I've had the shit kicked out of me for the last 5 years," he had said. And it wasn't an exaggeration. It was a surrender that tasted like blood. Doctors tried to help. So did therapists, nurses, and specialists flown in from across the globe. But Ozzy's decline wasn't something science could stop. His body, so long immune to consequence, now crumbled under years of defiance. The man who once howled across continents now struggled to lift a glass or sign his name. He had once seemed immortal, immune to pain, deaf to age, But even legends get tired. Even titans fall. Still, he refused to let the breakdown define him. Even when the pain bent him over. Even when tremors shook the cup from his hand. Even when the silence of his own bedroom felt heavier than 1,000 amps. Ozzy didn't ask for pity. He didn't mourn his strength. He mourned his speed, his fire, the rage that once surged through his veins like voltage. And as it faded, day by day, so did the armor that once made him larger than life. Now, there was only the man, bruised, scarred, breathing, but still standing, just slower, and with eyes that knew too much about suffering. It wasn't meant to be a goodbye, but everyone felt it. On July 5, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne walked, slowly, painfully, onto a stage in Birmingham for what would become his last live appearance. The arena pulsed with tension, with gratitude, with the kind of reverence that only belongs to farewells. 40,000 fans watched in silence as the Prince of Darkness, now bent by time and tremors, took his place under the lights one last time. He didn't come to impress. He came to exist. Supported by Sharon and his children, Ozzy gripped the mic stand like a lifeline. The voice that once shook rafters cracked and wavered, but it was still his. Each word he sang was carved from memory, pain, and legacy. Behind him stood the original members of Black Sabbath, gathered not for nostalgia, but for closure. This wasn't a concert. It was a communion. He performed only a few songs, but they were enough. Enough to remind everyone who he was. Enough to turn decades of noise into one perfect moment of silence between notes. The crowd didn't scream. They wept. They stood frozen, watching a man who once outran death now stand still with dignity. "This may be the last time I ever stand on stage," he whispered afterward. And even if no one wanted to believe it, everyone knew it was true. What followed was not a blaze of pyro or a thunder of distortion. It was a slow fade, a bow, a final gaze toward the crowd that had carried him for half a century. And then, quietly, he was gone. Backstage, his breathing was heavy. His hands trembled. Sharon wrapped a coat around his shoulders. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The next day, headlines called it historic. Fans flooded forums with messages like eulogies. Ozzy's final performance wasn't just a farewell. It was a lesson in how to leave. Not in flames, but in grace. Every dollar from that show, $190 million, was donated to causes that mattered most to him. Parkinson's research, children's hospitals, animal rescue. Even in his last bow, he gave everything away. The world didn't get a tour, didn't get an encore, but it got a goodbye. One forged in honesty, not hype. A farewell wrapped in fragility and fire. That night in Birmingham, Ozzy didn't just end a career, he completed a story. By early 2025, those closest to Ozzy knew the truth, even if the public didn't. He was dying, slowly, quietly, and each day became a countdown, not marked on calendars, but etched into glances and silences. Sharon saw it first, the way he stopped singing to himself in the mornings, the way he looked out the window longer than usual, as if memorizing the view. The vibrancy was fading. Jack, ever the protector, took charge of the practicalities. Doctor visits, medication schedules, home adaptations. He didn't ask his father to rest. He asked the world to prepare. Kelly stayed close, often sitting with him in the garden, reading him old headlines just to make him laugh. But even laughter became shorter, thinner, like wind slipping through cracks. They weren't mourning him yet, but they were bracing. The staff around the house grew quieter. Nurses moved with reverence. Visitors were fewer and hand-picked. Friends who saw him described a man already halfway into memory. Present? Yes, but dimmed. He was not in agony, but he was tired. In his eyes was a resignation too vast for words. the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that only the dying carry. In April, he stopped going to the studio. In May, he stopped leaving the house. By June, he stopped pretending. The cane became a walker. The walker became a wheelchair. But he never once asked why. He knew, and so did they. His inner circle, the ones who had watched him resurrect again and again, realized that this time there would be no comeback. They respected his silence. They didn't press, didn't plead. Instead, they cherished. They brought him his favorite records, sat with him through the night, laughed when he cursed at his body, held his hand when he couldn't stand. And slowly, gently, they began to say goodbye. Not all at once, but in moments, a shared look, a forehead kiss, a whispered thank you. Ozzy didn't talk about dying. He talked about the weather, about old shows, about dogs. He left the mourning to others, and in doing so, he gave them a gift, the chance to love him without fear. The truth is, everyone knew. They just never said it out loud. Because if Ozzy could face the end without flinching, the least they could do was follow his lead. The final week of Ozzy Osbourne's life didn't unfold with drama or fanfare. It crept in gently, disguised as routine. July 15th began like any other day. The sun stretched across his Buckinghamshire estate as nurses moved quietly through the halls. Sharon brought him his tea, lukewarm, with just a splash of milk, and sat beside him as he listened to old Sabbath demos on loop. He didn't say much, but his hand stayed in hers longer than usual. By the 16th, his strength had noticeably faded. He no longer tried to walk to the window, no longer reached for the guitar resting in the corner. That morning, he asked Jack to bring in the family dog. He rested his hand on the animal's fur for nearly half an hour, eyes closed, breathing slow but even. His words were brief, clear, but rare. "It's all right," he said once, not to anyone, just out loud, like a man giving permission to the end. The 17th brought a quiet tension to the house. Sharon called the children. No alarms were sounded, no panic, just the sense that it was time. Amy flew in from Los Angeles. Jessica and Louis called in. And Kelly never left the bedside. The family gathered not for a vigil, but for a farewell in slow motion. They laughed softly, played his favorite Beatles track, read him messages from fans across the world, told him the world still listened. By the 19th, he was barely responsive. He slept more than he woke. His lips moved to songs only he could hear. The doctors said it could be days, or it could be hours. He wasn't in pain, but his body had nothing left to give. Sharon, unshakable for months, finally cried. Not loud, just enough to fog her glasses. She kissed his forehead and whispered something only he heard, and then she stayed beside him. Day and night. July 21st passed with reverent stillness. Grandchildren came in one by one. Ozzy opened his eyes briefly around 4 p.m., looked at Kelly, smiled faintly, then closed them again. A nurse later said it felt like he was waiting for something, or someone. At 3:40 a.m. on July 22nd, his breathing slowed. Sharon held his hand. Jack touched his shoulder. The family surrounded him in complete silence. No machines, no wires, just skin on skin, love on love. At 3:47 a.m., he took his final breath. No gasp, no struggle, just a quiet exhale, as if letting go of the last burden he carried. The nurse whispered, "He's gone." Sharon didn't cry right away. She closed his eyes, kissed his knuckles, and stood up slowly, knowing the world had just changed. Ozzy Osbourne, the madman, the legend, the boy from Aston, was no longer alive. But in that room, he wasn't gone. He was everywhere. In the weeks that followed his passing, while sorting through old journals and documents, Sharon found something unexpected. Folded between pages of song drafts and appointment reminders was a handwritten letter. No envelope, no date. Just the title, "If I Go First." The handwriting was unmistakably his, erratic, aggressive, yet strangely careful. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific. It was addressed to everyone. The letter began with a confession. "I didn't think I'd live past 30. That line alone set the tone. It wasn't poetic, it was blunt, like most things Ozzy said. He wrote of his regrets, not rehearsing more with Randy, not calling his older kids enough, not being present when he should have been. But he didn't linger in guilt. He turned quickly to gratitude. To the fans who never stopped screaming, even when I couldn't, thank you. You kept me breathing." There were parts that were hard to read. Admissions of fear, of losing his voice, of being remembered only for madness, but also clarity. He spoke of Sharon like she was his compass, in a storm he never escaped. "If I ever seemed sane, it was because she held the pieces together." He wrote to his kids, each named, each line heavy with love, and begged them to keep going. "Don't carry my shadow, light your own fire." Toward the end of the letter, his tone changed. It softened. "If this gets found, I'm probably gone. And that's all right. I had one hell of a run. Just don't mourn me with silence. Play something loud. Blow the windows out." He didn't ask for statues or tributes. He asked for laughter, for rebellion, for remembrance, through noise, not tears. At the bottom, scrawled in red ink, almost as an afterthought, he had written, "P.S. I never apologized for biting the bat, but honestly, it deserved it." Sharon laughed through her tears when she read that. It was so him. Crude, irreverent, honest to the end. The letter wasn't meant for public release, but one day, she promised, it would be read aloud. Not in a press conference, but on a stage, with music behind it. Because that's how he wanted to be remembered, not by silence, but by the sound of a world still echoing with his voice. Sharon Osbourne had been through every version of Ozzy, brilliant, broken, blazing, and barely breathing, but nothing prepared her for the version that came in the final year. Quiet, frail, grateful. In those months, their conversation shifted. No longer about tours or business, but about peace, about legacy, about letting go. And one night, in the middle of a long silence, he asked her something she never wanted to answer. "Will you be all right?" She told him yes, lied to his face. Not because it was easy, but because that's what he needed to hear. In truth, she was already breaking. For decades, her life had orbited his chaos, his energy, his pain. Without that orbit, she didn't know who she'd be. But she smiled anyway, held his hand, told him she would carry him forward. And in that moment, she made a vow, not to move on, but to honor what they built. In private, Sharon began preparing for what she refused to name. Legal documents, medical arrangements, cremation instructions, a memorial fund. She didn't share it with the children. Not yet. It was too soon. But she carried the weight of it all, silently, like armor. She had faced record executives, scandal, betrayal, and illness. But this was the first war she couldn't win. Only endure. In the final week, when Ozzy's consciousness slipped in and out like a tide, Sharon barely slept. She refused to leave his side, even for meals. She brushed his hair, wiped his lips, played the songs they used to slow dance to when the world still believed they'd never last. And every night before she closed her eyes, she whispered the same thing, "I'm still here." After his passing, Sharon didn't collapse. She stood, greeted the nurses, made the calls, and faced the funeral arrangements with terrifying composure. It was only later, when the house was quiet, when the lights dimmed, when the last visitor left, that she allowed herself to fall apart. Not in grief alone, but in the hollow of promise. The vow she made? To protect his story, fiercely and truthfully. She kept everything: his notebooks, his boots, the cane he once hurled across the room in frustration. And she placed them not in storage, but in plain view, because Sharon Osbourne doesn't mourn in silence. She mourns in legacy. And through her, Ozzy isn't gone. He's present in every interview she gives, in every tribute she arranges, and in every moment she refuses to let the world forget what it nearly lost. In his final years, Ozzy Osbourne didn't chase fame. He chased moments, small, unrecorded fragments of rhythm and memory that no one else could hear but him. The studio in his Buckinghamshire home wasn't glamorous. It was cluttered. Dusty amps, sticky knobs, cords coiled like sleeping snakes, an old stool he refused to replace. It wasn't a place for production. It was a sanctuary, a confessional, a space where he could still be Ozzy, not the man in the wheelchair, not the patient, but the creator. And he never stopped creating. Even as his spine protested, even as his hands shook from Parkinson's, he found ways to sing. Quietly, breathlessly, but with fire. He'd mutter lines into a phone's voice memo app, scratch out lyrics in the margins of medical paperwork. He didn't tell many people what he was doing, because it wasn't for the charts, it wasn't for the radio, it was for him, for closure. The collection, which now sits with Sharon and Jack under the working title Ashes in Stereo, is haunting in its incompleteness. Only a few tracks are fully recorded, rough, imperfect, raw, but in them you can hear the truth. There's a track called Borrowed Breath, just vocals over a soft acoustic progression. Another named No Encore, where his voice cracks mid-chorus but keeps going. These aren't anthems. They're eulogies, spoken in melody, bleeding honesty. There are unfinished demos too. Hums, grunts, a single verse repeated 12 times as if he didn't want to move on to the next line. Lyrics like, "My bones sing louder than my voice these days," or "I don't miss the crowds, I miss the noise." One track, left untitled, ends with a whisper, "Turn it up, one last time." Producers close to him say he didn't want auto-tune. He didn't want polish. He told them, "If it sounds broken, it means I meant it." He wasn't chasing perfection. He was preserving reality, the same way he had lived, raw, reckless, never edited. Now, in the wake of his death, the family is left with the question, what to do with it all? Should it be released as is, or shaped into a posthumous farewell album? Kelly believes it should be untouched. Jack leans toward building it into a visual tribute. Sharon just wants it handled with reverence. "It's not content," she said. "It's him." Whether the world will ever hear these final songs in full remains unknown, but those who've listened say they're not just music. They're messages, not from a star, but from a man winding down, taking stock, leaving behind scraps of sound so he wouldn't be forgotten, not just by fans, but by himself. Ozzy once screamed to the world because it was the only way he knew how to speak. In his final recordings, he whispers. And somehow, that whisper might be the loudest thing he ever gave us. When the world lost Ozzy Osbourne, it didn't just lose a rock icon, it lost a father, a husband, a flawed, brilliant, chaotic man whose legacy stretched far beyond the stage. And while his records spin and his screams echo across generations, his most enduring legacy lives in flesh and blood, his children. Each one carries him differently, but all carry him powerfully. Kelly, always the loudest in spirit, became the unspoken guardian of his fire. In the days following his death, she posted a single photo, a blurry backstage moment, Ozzy mid-laugh, his eyeliner smudged, eyes alive. The caption read, "He taught me how to survive, even when he didn't know how." It was raw, simple, devastating. Kelly has already begun compiling stories, unfiltered, unglamorous, unguarded, for a podcast series that won't be interviews, but confessions. She wants fans to meet the father behind the legend, the man who danced with her in the kitchen, who cried during Disney movies, who once told her the scariest part of fame was forgetting what silence felt like. Jack, ever the observer, took on the quieter role. He's building a documentary titled Through the Madness, The Man Behind the Screams. He's pulled footage from home archives, Ozzy with the kids at Disneyland, sitting in a garden chair reading a bedtime story, practicing vocal scales even in his 60s. Jack wants to humanize the myth. We all know the bat story, but do they know how gentle he was with animals? How he used to save moths from the pool? Amy, distant from the spotlight for most of her life, returned to the music scene just weeks before his death, under her real name. No theatrics, no PR campaign. Just one song released on Bandcamp titled Michael. The lyrics are abstract, but the message is unmistakable. I carry your fire, and I don't need a stage to burn. Her grief is quiet, but it lingers in every note she plays. From his first marriage, Jessica and Louis chose privacy. They were rarely seen in public, even during the height of the Osbourne media craze. But in the days after his passing, they joined the family in Birmingham for a private memorial, one where no press was allowed. No cameras, just old records playing and the scent of burning incense. They stood in the background, but their presence was a reminder. Ozzy's roots were deep, even where the world couldn't see. Together, his children aren't just continuing his legacy, they're reshaping it. They're peeling back the leather and studs, the fire and fog, to reveal the man who called himself a mess with a heartbeat. Through them, he doesn't just live on, he evolves, and perhaps that's the truest mark of a legend. Not that they're remembered for who they were, but that they continue to grow long after they're gone. The Osbournes are not just a family, they are a living echo, and Ozzy's fire is still burning in every one of them. Behind every headline, every scandal, every stadium roar, there was a quieter truth about Ozzy Osbourne. His greatest battle was never with drugs, or disease, or even death. It was with the silence inside him. The kind born in childhood bedrooms where fear replaced affection. The kind that lingered in hotel rooms after the crowd stopped screaming. Ozzy never wanted attention. He wanted escape, and fame for a time looked like freedom. But it wasn't. It was a mirror, one that reflected every wound he never healed. He didn't sing to be admired. He sang to be heard, to scream into the abyss so it wouldn't swallow him. And when the music faded, when the lights dimmed, when his voice cracked with age, what remained was the boy from Aston, still scared, still searching. He once said, "Music saved me," but what he never said aloud was that survival is not a single act. It's 1,000 tiny choices made in the dark. To get up, to try again, to scream even when no one's listening. That was his real legacy, not the madness, but the movement through it. Not the chaos, but the courage. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a rock star. He was a man who clawed his way out of silence and taught millions to do the same. And now, in death, he doesn't vanish. He becomes what he always chased, an echo too loud to be ignored. Ozzy Osbourne is gone, but the silence he leaves behind is anything but empty. It hums with memory, with riffs that raised the dead and lyrics that gave the broken a voice. He didn't die quietly, he lived loudly, and now, even in death, he roars, through the speakers, through the tattoos, through the stories told under stadium lights and whispering at kitchen tables. He was chaos, yes, but he also cared. He was addicted to survival, pain, and poetry. A man who should have died 100 times, but chose to live one more day, again and again, for those who needed him to. Ozzy didn't teach us how to be perfect. He taught us how to persist. If his voice ever carried you through the dark, if his songs ever gave you courage, say thank you. Say it out loud, because legends don't die in silence. They echo, and Ozzy, he'll echo forever. Rest easy, Ozzy Osbourne. The stage is empty now, but your shadow still moves across it. In every scream, in every tear, in every beat of a drum, your fire remains. You didn't just survive. You lit the way for the rest of us. And now, finally, you can rest.